let's dig into that wired but tired stress thing. What is going on in the body from a sleep perspective, in the body and the brain, when you're in a high stress lifestyle?
Yeah, there's probably at least two things going on in the body and at least one thing going up in the brain. The first in the body is the balance between the two branches of your nervous system. One is the fight or flight branch called the sympathetic nervous system. It's very poorly named. It's anything but sympathetic. It's very agitating and activating. And then there's the parasympathetic. That's the kind of quiescent branch of your nervous system. If you're a good, healthy sleeper and you don't have too much stress in your life, you naturally switch over to that restful, quiescent branch of the nervous system. And that is the royal kind of pathway to good sleep. And the alacrity of sleep, the speed with which sleep arrives to you when you disengage from the fight or flight branch, is really speedy and rather beautiful. If you are so wired, though, however, the sympathetic, the fight or flight branch is activated, your heart rate is jacked, your blood pressure is too high, your temperature, because of that activated state, your core body temperature is also too high. If you are too hot, your heart is racing and your blood pressure is high, it's very difficult for you to fall asleep. Add atop of that a second system in the body, which is what we call the HPA axis, or it's essentially the stress axis, which descends down from a brainstem area, the hypothalamus, down to the pituitary, releases adrenaline. All of a sudden, you are cortisol flooded. And I think everyone has had that sense where, whether it's, let's say you've been on stage, you've been on tour, you come off stage and you are wired. Now, this is not you're anxious, but you're still wired. Cortisol is streaming, your heart rate is jacked. And you can say, I was up at 7 this morning and it's now 2 o'clock because all is said and done. I am still unable to fall asleep. I'm so tired, but I am way too cortisol, sort of concentrated.
Dominant, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So those two things in the body are what we will presumably, I think most people will cleave to as the ingredients to the tired but wide phenomena. I also think upstairs, and they are interrelated, upstairs in the brain, you start to get this Rolodex of anxiety. And I think we've all had that where we're stressed. In the modern world, we're constantly on reception. Very rarely do we do reflection. And now the only time, based on modernity and how it inflects us, that we do reflection is when our head hits the pillow at night. That's the worst time to do reflection, because when you start to have that kind of wheel of anxiety whirring, you begin to ruminate. When you ruminate, you catastrophize. Everything seems twice as bad in the dark of night versus the light of day. And at that point, you're dead in the water for the next 2 hours. And that will then only feed in to jacking up the fight or flight branch, because you're kind of going through, what didn't I do today? What should I have done? What do I need to do tomorrow? I forgot to do that thing that's critical for next week. It's a mental sort of, train wreck in terms of your sleep that then just further perpetuates those two downstream physiological sort of consequences to the body. And then they ramp up, and that leads to more. Yeah.
Talk to me about interventions for those three.
So the principal one is that you've got to process that. And this is the hard part of the equation. Mental health work is tough work. You can take medications, and that can be one path for people. You can take certain medications that can try to lower your heart rate, shift you back over into that quiescent state. But most people don't want to reach for a pill immediately necessarily. One thing you can do is just catharsis. 2 or 3 hours before bed, not right before bed, pad of paper and a pen, and just write down. I just want you to vomit out all of your stresses and anxieties. And it turns out that simply doing that will decrease the time it takes you to fall asleep by 50%.
No way.
Yeah, it's a great study. Michael Scullin, fantastic work. So the first thing is just get it all out of you, so it's not inside of you. That said, you can still be burdened with this egregious kind of stress and anxiety nevertheless. So what do you do about that? At that moment in time, whether it's you falling asleep or you've woken up at 3 a.m. and it's happening and you need to get back to sleep, at that point, let's get your mind off itself. That is the goal. How do you do that? Maybe at least 4 things. First, meditation. The data is really strong. Now, I was researching this for a book, and I just thought, look, I'm a hard-nosed scientist. I'm here at UC Berkeley, San Francisco. It's all a bit woo-woo, this meditation thing. I'm sort of holding hands and people are strumming guitars at the end of the day. What is going on? I don't believe this. Studies were so powerful, though. So I thought, I best bloody try some of this myself. And that was 6 years ago. And I now meditate for 10 minutes every night before bed. So the first is meditation. But people just may not feel particularly compelled towards meditation. No problem. Next one is breath work. And you can just Google different types of breath, box breathing, sort of, 3-7-4. There's all sorts of different patterns. But that breathing can also just try to bring the nervous system back down into that zone of sleep permission versus sleep prevention when it's too high. If that isn't your thing, you can do a body scan. So just close your eyes, start at the top of your head, and just start to relax back. Feel your neck, feel how tense it is, start to relax it. Maybe even your forehead, is that tense? And just move through the rest of the body, go all the way down through your arms, through your chest, your back, and you're not making any judgments. You're just being aware of your body. That's fantastic too. The final thing, if none of those appeal, mental walk in hyper detail. So think about, let's say, a walk that you do with your dog. And what I want you to do is think about this at the level of, okay, I open the drawer. Which leash am I going to take, the blue or the red? I'll take the blue one. Clip the dog in with my right hand. I'm closing the drawer with my left. Open the front door with the left. I go down the stairs. I look across. There's that weird Berkeley house. It's kind of just a little bit hippie, but no problem. And then the cars always come too quickly around that. But that's the level of hyper detail. And what's interesting, if you look across all 4 of the things I've just described, the commonality is that they all get your mind off itself. Meditation, you're starting to focus on something other than your mind. If you're doing box breathing, you're all of a sudden body-centric, not mind-centric. If you're starting to do some type of body scan, again, it's hard for you to think about your worries and your stresses if you're doing it. Mental walk, same thing. Because sleep at that time of night is a little bit like trying to remember someone's name. The harder you try, the further you push it away. Sleep is something that happens to us. It's not something that we make happen. And when you get that mind distracted away from itself, the next thing you typically remember is the alarm going off in the morning. Why? Because you got your mind off itself.
Okay, so first one, quantity. Second one, quality, that being a component of that. Is there anything else to say on quality before we move on?
Yeah, probably. The other way that we measure, and most people can't do this, but is in the sleep laboratory, we place electrodes on your head. You look like a spaghetti monster. And the other way we measure quality is the depth of your deep non-REM sleep. So we have 2 main types of sleep, REM and non-REM. Non-REM, for most sleep trackers, you divide it into light non-REM and deep non-REM. Deep non-REM is where you get these incredible, deep, powerful, slow brain waves. They're just epic. And the depth, the size of those brain waves and how dense they are, the number of them that you're having is another great measure of the quality, the electrophysiological quality of your sleep versus are you waking up lots throughout the night and therefore you're spending a lot of time awake? That's sleep efficiency. That's another measure of quality. So they're sort of orthogonal, but both bleed into this kind of second silo of sleep quality. So QQ, next one is regularity. Going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time. And you think, this sounds fairly rudimentary and basic. Part of the reason is because you have a 24-hour master clock in your brain. And that clock thrives under conditions of regularity. And when you feed it signals of regularity, like going to bed and waking up at the same time, it improves both the quantity and the quality of your sleep. That's what I used to preach as why it was important. until there was a great study published probably 2.5 years ago. And it was, I think, over 300,000 individuals that they tracked with sleep assessments over a good period of time. And then they looked at them across a much longer lifespan period of time. And they looked at mortality risk. And they also looked at different forms of mortality risk, cancer mortality risk, cardiovascular disease mortality risk. And they measured sleep quantity. Sure enough, just like we've seen in many other studies, using that sweet spot of 7 to 9 hours, the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicted all-cause mortality. That's the quantity measure. They looked at regularity. Regularity demonstrated the same thing. Those who were in the lowest quartile, those who were least regular, highly erratic, they had far higher rates of mortality relative to the people who were in the top quartile, who were incredibly regular.
How did that compare to the quantity in terms of predictive power?
Genius. And that was the brilliance of the study that really made me double down on regularity. Because then what they did, they said, well, if we've got these two measures, quantity and regularity, let's not look at them individually. Let's put them in the same statistical model and do a Coke Pepsi challenge between the two. And all of us in the sleep field, you're betting that quantity is going to be the more powerful statistical variable. It wasn't. Regularity beat out quantity in predicting all-cause mortality, cancer mortality, cardiovascular mortality. Now, it's not to say that you can get away with short quantity of sleep,
as long as it's
even
at the
if
same
you're
time.
highly regular. Getting 4 hours of sleep at the same time every night, you still have markedly elevated mortality risk. But nevertheless, I was pretty stunned by how powerful that was, and made me, even someone who was pretty regular before, get a bit more evangelical about it.
I'm interested in, I saw a study a little while ago, I don't know whether it ever got replicated, looking at e-readers and looking at the effect of e-readers. Most of them now, the best Kindles have got a warmth level as well as a brightness level.
Yeah.
Have you looked at, a lot of people want to read, but if you're reading and you're reading a paper book, that means you got to have a light on. Light's quite bright.
Yeah.
So you can go to a Kindle and you can pull that down, but that's a screen. Have you looked at anything to do with light exposure from e-readers impacting sleep quality?
It's really interesting. And that's actually a great way to continue to engage with, digital media in terms of reading, if that's all you're doing. So the page is black, the text is a cream or a white. Therefore, the amount of lux that's coming from the screen is already lower versus, because obviously the background is the far more dominant constituent of that page. So black paper, white text, that's perfectly fine. You've got to be a bit careful in terms of what you're reading. If it's the content, if it's all sorts of salacial stuff, then, maybe the heart rate is going in the wrong direction. But for the most part, that's completely fine. But I would say, even if two things about your phone. If you have to take the phone into your room, because again, I don't want to be puritanical, that genie of the phone being in the room is out the bottle and it's not going back in, no matter what I say. 2 rules. If you can find some software that can try to turn the screen monochromatic. So everything goes black and white. And it's pretty surprising at how reduced in terms of the activation.
And my phone's next door. Let me show you this. I'm going to, hang on. Wait there, people.
I promise people who are listening, we did not plan this. This is completely...
So you'll know that there's a accessibility function that allows you to turn things grayscale.
Yep.
Have you ever seen anyone do that?
Oh, that's genius.
And turn all of the blue off and turn it just red. So you can see here.
How on earth did you do that?
Just internally on iPhone. So you go into settings and accessibility, and then the same as you triple click to go grayscale, the same function, but you just use the slider on the red side.
Oh,
you kill all of the color except for red. And that means it's so much darker. So when you do this, especially if you need to use it a little bit later on in the evening, and I triple click and it goes from...
You just stack the two things, which is first, it's almost monochromatic, but second, it's desaturated the blue light, and it's the blue light, which is the lower wavelengths that are most deleterious to harming your melatonin. It's that
black belt
cool
strategy.
Blue light.
That's
by the way, do you know why it's the blue light that's so bad for your melatonin? Why it's so powerful in terms of...
Is that because when the sun is lowest in the sky in morning, it's when the sun is highest in the sky, it's more blue, and when it's lower and it's going through more atmosphere, it's redder. Is that why?
Some of that is true, but it's not the main reason. It's because where we evolved from. We evolved from the ocean, from the sea.
Okay.
And there, because of the way that light is refracted through water, the principal color of the sea, of the ocean, are blues. And so where we evolved our circadian rhythm originally was under the water. And the way it was regulated was using light, but the color of light under the water was principally blue because it was kind of desaturated from the reds and the yellows. Isn't that amazing?
That's so crazy. This isn't even reptile brain. This is fish.
Oh, no. This is, reptiles, amphibian, fish. We are way before, avian and mammalian, sort of emergence. And by the way, it's only in birds and mammals that we see this thing called REM sleep or dream sleep. And it's a surprising thing. And we still don't understand what that tells us about the functions of REM sleep. REM sleep is the principal stage in which we dream. And with every living species that we've studied to date sleeps. What that means is that sleep probably evolved with life itself on this planet and fought its way through heroically every step along the evolutionary path. Ergo, if sleep doesn't serve an absolutely vital function, it's the biggest mistake the evolutionary process has ever made. And we now realize why it didn't make a blunder. But what's interesting is that what first came into being was this thing called non-rapid eye movement sleep. And for millennia, there was no rapid eye movement sleep. There's no dream sleep. Something happened when we went from amphibians, reptiles, and fish up to birds and mammals. Now, birds and mammals evolved separately in two separate lineages from reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Birds have REM sleep. Mammals have REM sleep. What that means, firstly, is that REM sleep evolved twice independently in the course of evolution. When you see the same thing evolve twice or more times, like eyes, for example, it tells you that it's probably a fundamental trait of a living species. So what we don't still understand, though, is why do birds and mammals require why did REM sleep emerge into being? Now, we've got some theories because one of the differences is that birds and mammals regulate their temperature. We are homeotherms. We get the ability to control our core body temperature. All of those other species don't. So it has to be something to do perhaps with metabolic control to produce thermoregulation. There's probably other theories too, but nevertheless, going back to the evolutionary story, and we'll come back to, I haven't forgotten the final T for QRT, but I've put forward a theory that sleep actually never evolved. Why do we think that sleep evolved? Why don't we think that sleep was the default state of all life, and it was from sleep that wakefulness evolved? I've always been confused why we don't.
Well, because you wouldn't be able to survive if you just slept, but you could survive if you just woke.
The idea would be, though, that if sleep is this initial default state, it is enough to support life and its existence. And some of those species could reproduce potentially asexually, so you wouldn't have to necessarily be awake to find a mate. You could at least have a proto-version of life, and the proto-version requires this stasis state that we call sleep.
It would somehow accumulate nutrients by falling through gravity. And,
correct.
Right.
You think of, there's any manner of static living organisms that stay in place that don't move around. But then at some point, there was enough evolutionary pressure to demand this thing called movement and demand higher levels of consciousness. And it was, so that's one way of seeing it. I think the other is, let's say wakefulness came first. Why don't we then just have wakefulness? Why do we need sleep? Sleep is clearly the price that we pay for wakefulness.
One question I had, do sleeping positions matter? Why? Why do people have habits when it comes to their sleeping positions?
It's really interesting that people say, I'm a back sleeper, I'm a side sleeper. That's not really true. You will typically sleep in almost all of those positions throughout the night. It's just what is the dominant position. And when people say, I am a X sleeper or Y sleeper. You're just talking about what you typically do more often relative to the other positions. More people are side sleepers than front sleepers or back sleepers. About 60% of people are most often side sleeping. Position doesn't matter, with probably two exceptions, although one of them has an asterisk, which is I don't want to scaremonger. The first is definitive. If you are snoring, if you have sleep apnea or if you know anyone who is snoring and they have not been tested for sleep apnea, go and get them tested. Or if you are, go and get tested. It's real easy to figure out if you're a snorer or not. Download an app. I have no association with them. It's called Snore Lab, Snore Lab, Android, Apple. You open it up, you hit record, you place the phone down by your bedside, it listens to your snoring, and then at the end of the night, you can see the amount of snoring, and it grades it from quiet, moderate, loud, and epic. And you see these Richter shocks throughout the night. The worse still, you can then go and tap at any moment in your night, and you can listen to yourself gasping for breath and snoring. Because snoring, what happens when you snore is that the airway starts to partially collapse. And when it starts to partially collapse, like a straw that gets bent, you start to get these fluctuations, these eddies in the airway. And that's the partial collapsing of the airway. When the airway collapses completely, the straw goes flat effectively. That's when you stop breathing entirely. And you can be there for 15, 20 seconds and your blood oxygen saturation just starts to plummet. And at some point, your brainstem, which picks up the ratio of the gases in your bloodstream between carbon dioxide and oxygen, says, break glass in case of emergency.
Wake him up.
We've got to wake him up. And that's the moment where you hear, and you gasp and you're back up again. As a consequence, you're never going into deep sleep. You stay in those shallows of sleep. Now, mild sleep apnea, if you have these, what we call apnea events, and apnea is a word, it's beautiful. Pnea is breath, from a Latin derivative. Anything in medicine that has the word a before it is usually the absence of it. Arrhythmia, the absence of a normal rhythmic heart. Apnea is the absence of breath. And mild sleep apnea is you having maybe 5 to 15 of the events per hour. That's how we grade it. For each hour of sleep, how many of these events are you having? Mild sleep apnea, let's just call it 10 events. And you're asleep for 8 hours. Imagine if I were to come in and say, tonight, Chris, I'm going to come into your room, and for the entire night, maybe 80 times throughout the night, I'm going to come in and I'm going to throttle you around your throat to the point where your oxygen saturation drops below 80%. Do you think you're going to feel good by tomorrow morning? The answer is no. But so many people are living with undiagnosed sleep apnea. We think at least 80% of people who have sleep apnea are undiagnosed right now. Yeah. And that will put you in an early grave.
Is snoring the same as sleep apnea?
No, it's not. You can have snoring and it will not classify as sleep apnea. You still want to understand why you're snoring, but nevertheless, you can just get a very simple home test. In fact, you can look at your risk for sleep apnea already. Go online and type in the search term stop bang questionnaire. Stop bang questionnaire. And again, it takes probably 2 minutes to fill out, and it will give you a risk hazard ratio of how likely is it that you have sleep apnea. And it correlates very well with an at-home sleep apnea test. So it's a good, quick proxy. I love Snore Lab, though. That's another great way to frighten yourself into understanding what's exactly happening. So all of which to say, I think I'm forgetting how we got here, but nevertheless,
sleeping positions.
Sleeping position is one of those situations where when you are lying on your back, you are allowing your airway the direct access to this thing called gravity. And when gravity is present with back sleeping, it's far easier to pull that straw flat shut. So that's why we typically don't like people with sleep apnea sleeping on their back. The old school approach, gosh, when I was coming up to sort of start to treat was, or to at least get you away from a back sleeping position, was you would ask the gentleman, usually they're more heavy set, you would ask them, find a t-shirt from your wife, usually smaller, and get that t-shirt that has a pocket on the breast. And then I want you to wear that tight t-shirt back to front. And then I want your wife to take a tennis ball before you sleep and put it in the pocket.
Yeah.
And every time you roll over, it's so uncomfortable that you train yourself out of back sleeping.
Wow.
And so that's the old school.
Is that, so why do we have preferences for sleeping position? Is this chronotype? Is this just habitual? Can we train ourselves out to being
usually based on your skeletal ergonomics and how you want to sleep? It's also in part driven absent of your body based on your mattress.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, you know, having a mattress that's at least supportive enough where you don't get that banana bowing. Because if you are a front sleeper and you're sleeping on a poor mattress, then all of a sudden you just get this every night, this bending of the spinal cord, and you're lying there. I might just say, okay, today for 8 hours, I'm going to have you compressed into this banana shape lying on your front. And then at the end of that 8 hours, get up and, you know, do 10 jumping jacks and feel great. Not so much. So you've got to be mindful of the position. So I would say sleeping on your back if you're a snorer, not so great. There is some evidence that sleeping, and I'm going to forget which side it is now. I'm trying to think of my anatomy, but sleeping, I think it's on your left side, based on how your gastrointestinal system is working, leads to a greater degree of GERD, which is gastric reflux. In other words, getting heartburn. You just get reflux.
Interesting.
So that's the second one, though, really, that I was going to mention is sleeping on your front or on your back may not necessarily be ideal, because what they found is that during sleep, and this quick tangent, I'll come back to it, but another one of the new functions of sleep is brain cleansing. That when we go into sleep, your brain essentially has this sewage system that kicks into high gear, and it washes away all of the metabolic detritus that's been building up across wakefulness. Because from a biochemical perspective, wakefulness is low-level brain damage. Sleep is your sanitary salvation. And two of the pieces of metabolic detritus that sleep system will cleanse your brain of are beta amyloid and tau protein, which are the two culprits that underlie, we believe, the Alzheimer's disease cascade. And what's interesting is that when you are sleeping on your side, these are animal studies, they found that that cleansing system is more efficient than when you're sleeping on your back or your front. And what they did was they showed this in rats and in mice. And then I was watching this, I was at a conference. They started to show you pictures in the wild of every single animal sleeping. What was common across all of them, no matter how they contorted their body, the common ingredient was that their head was always on one side or the other. As if that was the natural sort of tendency, the predilection of how sleep was optimally designed. And they argued that the reason for that is because that's when you get greatest optimality of flow of this, what we call the glymphatic cleansing system. Now, I would say that I haven't seen strong replication of that, nor have I seen any evidence that that's true in human beings. Human beings are a very odd species. Our head is tilted 90 degrees relative to many others. Think about a giraffe, a donkey, think about a dog, a cat. Their head is lifted up in line with their spinal cord. When we went from being quadrupeds to bipeds, one of the things that had to happen, because we were walking on all fours with our head out like a dog, if you then stood up on your back legs but kept the head in that same position, all you're doing is getting very deep interest in clouds. So our head tilted down 90 degrees. And so that means that our ergonomics of the head and the cranium may be very different to animals. So I think the jury is out, and I don't think that's any good reason for you to start worrying about, oh my goodness, I've got to get my head to the side, and if I'm not, if it's down on the pillow or I'm on my back, don't worry about that.